What happens when justice becomes fire and fire becomes legend? Tonight we dive into one of America's most chilling historical mysteries, a story that will take you through the darkest chapters of our past and into a legend that refuses to die. This is the tale of 30 farms reduced to ash in a single night, and the man who vanished like smoke into the darkness, leaving behind only flames and questions that echo through history. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. This epic story spans decades and will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice, revenge, and the power of one man's unbreakable will. The story begins not with fire, but with freedom. Ezekiel Freeman was born on a crisp October morning in 1822, in a small cabin on the outskirts of Richmond, Virginia. His mother, Sarah Freeman, had purchased her own freedom 3 years earlier, with money earned from years of taking in laundry and mending clothes for wealthy white families. His father, Joshua, was a skilled carpenter who had been manumitted by his master's will upon the old man's death. For the first 7 years of his life, Ezekiel knew what it meant to be free. He played in the woods behind their cabin, learned to read from his mother's worn Bible, and watched his father craft beautiful furniture with hands that belonged to no one but himself. The Freeman family was part of Richmond's small but growing community of free blacks, people who had carved out lives of dignity in a world that constantly reminded them of their precarious position. Sarah Freeman was a woman of remarkable strength and intelligence. Standing barely 5 feet tall with graying hair she kept wrapped in colorful cloth, she possessed an inner fire that seemed to burn brighter than any physical flame. She had taught herself to read and write, skills she passed on to her son with fierce determination. "Knowledge is freedom, Ezekiel," she would tell him as they sat by candlelight, tracing letters in the dirt floor of their cabin. "They can take everything from you, your home, your family, your very body, but they cannot take what you carry in your mind." Joshua Freeman was quieter than his wife, but no less determined. A tall, lean man with calloused hands and gentle eyes, he had learned his trade from a master who believed in developing his slaves' skills. When freedom came, Joshua used those skills to build a modest but respectable business. He crafted furniture for both black and white families, his reputation for quality work, transcending the racial barriers that defined Virginia society. "Every piece I make," he told young Ezekiel, as they worked together in the small workshop behind their home, "is a declaration. It says that a free black man can create beauty, can build something lasting, can contribute to this world." But freedom for black families in 1820s Virginia was always fragile, always under threat. The laws were designed to make their lives difficult. Free blacks had to carry papers proving their status, couldn't travel without permits, faced constant suspicion and harassment. And there were those who saw any successful black family as a threat to the natural order. The Freemans' downfall came from an unexpected source, their own success. By 1829, Joshua's furniture business had grown prosperous enough to attract the attention of Cornelius Blackwood, a slave trader who also dealt in the kidnapping and re-enslavement of free blacks. Blackwood was a man of medium height but imposing presence, with cold gray eyes and a reputation for ruthlessness that extended throughout the region. He had noticed the Freeman family's prosperity and decided they represented an opportunity. The attack came on a humid August night in 1829. Ezekiel, now 7 years old, was awakened by the sound of splintering wood and his mother's screams. Through the crack in his bedroom door, he watched as 6 men burst into their cabin, led by Blackwood himself. "Where are your freedom papers?" Blackwood demanded, grabbing Sarah by the throat. "In the chest," she gasped, pointing to a wooden box that Joshua had crafted to hold their most precious possessions. Blackwood opened the chest and pulled out the carefully preserved documents that proved the Freeman family's legal status. Without hesitation, he threw them into the fireplace where they curled and blackened in the flames. "What papers?" he said with a cold smile. "I don't see any papers." What followed was a nightmare that would haunt Ezekiel for the rest of his life. He watched from his hiding place as his father was beaten unconscious with iron clubs. He saw his mother's desperate attempts to protect her family, her fierce spirit finally broken by the reality of their helplessness. And then he was dragged from his hiding place, his small hands bound with rough rope, his cries for his parents ignored as he was thrown into a wagon with other kidnapped blacks. The last thing he saw as the wagon pulled away was his family's cabin burning in the distance, orange flames licking at the night sky like hungry tongues. Ezekiel's first master was a tobacco farmer named Jeremiah Hawkins, whose plantation lay 50 miles south of Richmond. Hawkins was a man who believed that slaves needed to be broken early, like wild horses, to ensure their compliance throughout their lives. For 6 years, Ezekiel endured a systematic campaign designed to destroy his spirit. He was given the name Boy, and forbidden to use his real name. He was beaten for speaking without permission, for looking white people in the eye, for any sign of the intelligence and dignity his parents had instilled in him. But Sarah Freeman's lessons had taken root too deeply to be easily destroyed. In the darkness of the slave quarters, Ezekiel held on to his memories like precious treasures. He remembered his mother's voice reading from the Bible. He remembered his father's hands shaping wood into beauty. He remembered what it felt like to be free. And slowly, carefully, he began to learn. Ezekiel discovered that invisibility could be a weapon. By appearing docile and broken, he could move through the plantation unnoticed, overhearing conversations that revealed the master's weaknesses and fears. He learned that Hawkins was deeply in debt, that his wife was having an affair with the overseer, that the plantation was on the verge of bankruptcy. He also learned about the underground network of resistance that existed among the enslaved population. Older slaves taught him which plants could be used as medicine, which could be used as poison. They showed him how to read the signs that indicated a slave catcher was in the area, how to navigate by the stars, how to survive in the wilderness. Most importantly, they taught him about the concept of justice, not the white man's justice, which was really just another form of oppression, but a deeper, more fundamental justice that transcended human law. God sees everything, boy, an old slave named Moses told him one night as they sat around a hidden fire in the woods. Every lash of the whip, every family torn apart, every child sold away from their mama, and someday, somehow, there's going to be a reckoning. In 1835, when Ezekiel was 13, Jeremiah Hawkins died of a heart attack. The plantation was sold to pay his debts, and the slaves were auctioned off individually. Ezekiel found himself on the auction block in Richmond, just a few miles from where he had been born free. Standing naked on the platform while white men examined his muscles and teeth like those of a horse, Ezekiel made a silent promise to himself. Someday, he would make them pay, all of them, for every humiliation, every beating, every moment of stolen freedom. But first he had to survive. Ezekiel's second master was Marcus Henderson, owner of one of the largest plantations in Millfield County. Henderson was different from Hawkins, more intelligent, more calculating, and infinitely more dangerous. Henderson had purchased Ezekiel not for field work, but for a special purpose. The boy was strong for his age, intelligent despite his lack of formal education, and most importantly, he had learned to be invisible. Henderson needed someone who could move between plantations, carrying messages and conducting business that required discretion. "You're going to be my eyes and ears, boy," Henderson told him on his first day. "You'll go where I send you, do what I tell you, and report back everything you see and hear. In return, you'll be fed well, clothed properly, and treated better than the field hands. But if you ever betray my trust, if you ever try to run or cause trouble, I'll make sure you suffer in ways you can't imagine." For 12 years, Ezekiel served as Henderson's personal agent, traveling throughout Virginia and into neighboring states. He carried messages between plantation owners, transported valuable goods, and conducted business that his master preferred to keep secret. But what Henderson didn't realize was that he was giving Ezekiel the perfect education in the hidden workings of the slavery system. As he moved from plantation to plantation, Ezekiel witnessed horrors that went far beyond the everyday brutality of slave life. At Riverside Plantation, he saw James Morrison's breeding program, enslaved women treated like livestock, forced to bear children who would be sold as soon as they were old enough to work. Morrison kept detailed records of bloodlines and genetic traits, trying to breed slaves the way others bred horses or cattle. At Oak Grove Plantation, he witnessed Robert Caldwell's system of collective punishment, When one slave committed even a minor infraction, Caldwell would punish the entire slave population, creating an atmosphere of fear and mutual surveillance that made resistance nearly impossible. At Magnolia Heights, he observed Henry Patterson's psychological torture methods, techniques designed to break spirits without leaving physical marks that might reduce a slave's market value. But it was at his own master's plantation that Ezekiel encountered the worst horrors of all. Marcus Henderson was conducting medical experiments on enslaved people. In a hidden basement beneath the main house, Henderson had set up a crude laboratory where he tested the limits of human endurance. He wanted to know how much pain a person could survive, how long they could work without food or rest, how their bodies responded to various diseases and treatments. Ezekiel's job was to help dispose of the bodies when the experiments went too far. "Science requires sacrifice," Henderson would say as they buried another victim in the woods behind the plantation. "These people are contributing to the advancement of human knowledge. Their suffering serves a greater purpose." Each burial was another weight on Ezekiel's soul, another debt that would someday need to be paid. But he also began to see a pattern in Henderson's work. The plantation owner was keeping detailed records of his experiments, documenting everything with scientific precision. Those records, Ezekiel realized, would be evidence of crimes that even slavery's defenders would find difficult to justify. As the years passed, Ezekiel began to develop a plan. He couldn't save the people who were already dead, but he could ensure that their deaths would not be meaningless. He began secretly copying Henderson's records, memorizing names and dates, building a case that would someday expose the full scope of the horrors he had witnessed. He also began reaching out to the underground network of resistance that he had first learned about as a child. Using his position as Henderson's agent, he made contact with free blacks, sympathetic whites, and runaway slaves throughout the region. Slowly, carefully, he began building a network of his own. But in 1847, everything changed. Marcus Henderson died suddenly of a fever, and his estate was put up for sale. Ezekiel found himself once again on the auction block, this time purchased by the very man who had destroyed his family 18 years earlier, Cornelius Blackwood. Standing in chains before the man who had burned his freedom papers and murdered his childhood, Ezekiel felt something shift inside him. The careful patience he had maintained for so many years began to crack, replaced by a cold, focused rage that burned like ice in his veins. Blackwood didn't recognize him. To the slave trader, one black face was much like another, but Ezekiel recognized Blackwood, and he began to plan his revenge. The time for patience was over. The time for justice had come. Cornelius Blackwood's slave trading operation was a monument to human misery. Located on the outskirts of Richmond, it consisted of a series of wooden buildings surrounded by high fences topped with iron spikes. The main structure housed Blackwood's office and living quarters, while smaller buildings served as holding pens for slaves awaiting sale. When Ezekiel arrived in chains, he was thrown into a pen with 30 other men, women, and children. The conditions were deliberately harsh: minimal food, no sanitation, constant overcrowding. Blackwood believed that desperate slaves sold for lower prices, and he had no interest in maintaining their health or dignity. But Ezekiel was no longer the terrified 7-year-old who had been torn from his family. 25 years old now, he stood 6 feet tall with the lean, powerful build of a man who had survived 2 decades of hard labor. His face bore the scar of a branding iron accident that Henderson had arranged when Ezekiel was 16. A jagged line across his left cheek that gave him a fierce, unforgettable appearance. More importantly, his mind had been sharpened by years of observation and planning. He knew how the system worked, understood its weaknesses, and had connections throughout the underground network of resistance. Within days of his arrival, Ezekiel had established himself as a leader among the imprisoned slaves. He organized the sharing of food to ensure that children and the elderly received adequate nutrition. He settled disputes before they could escalate into violence that would bring punishment from the guards. Most importantly, he began gathering information. "Tell me about your masters," he would say to newly arrived slaves. "What were their names? Where were their plantations? What did they do to you?" Each story added another name to the list that Ezekiel carried in his memory. a catalogue of crimes that stretched across Virginia and into neighboring states. But he was particularly interested in stories about the most brutal masters, the ones whose cruelty went beyond even the accepted norms of slavery. It was during his third week in Blackwood's holding pen that Ezekiel received an unexpected visitor. Ezekiel Freeman? He looked up to see a well-dressed black woman standing outside the pen, flanked by two of Blackwood's guards. She was small and elderly, with grey hair and intelligent eyes that seemed familiar. "Do I know you?" he asked, approaching the fence. "You should," she said with a sad smile. "I'm your mother." The reunion between Sarah and Ezekiel Freeman was both joyful and heartbreaking. For 18 years, Sarah had searched for her son, following every lead, investigating every rumor. She had saved every penny she could earn, building a fund to purchase his freedom if she ever found him. "I never stopped looking," she told him through the fence, tears streaming down her face. "Not for a single day." "How did you find me?" Ezekiel asked, his own voice thick with emotion. "The underground network. Word travels fast among our people. When someone reported that Cornelius Blackwood had purchased a slave named Ezekiel with a scar on his face, I knew it had to be you." Sarah had come prepared. She carried with her the legal documents necessary to purchase Ezekiel's freedom, along with enough money to complete the transaction. After 18 years of separation, the Freeman family would finally be reunited. But when she approached Blackwood with her offer, the slave trader's response was not what she expected. "I'm not selling," he said flatly. "But I have the money," Sarah protested, "more than you paid for him." Blackwood leaned back in his chair, studying her with cold eyes. "That boy is special. Strong, intelligent, experienced. I can get twice what you're offering from the right buyer. Maybe 3 times. "Please," Sarah begged. "He's my son. I've been searching for him for 18 years. "Then you should have taken better care of him," Blackwood replied with a cruel smile. "Maybe if you hadn't been so careless, he wouldn't have ended up in chains in the first place." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She knew that Blackwood was the one who had kidnapped her family, but she couldn't prove it. And even if she could, no court in Virginia would take the word of a black woman against a white man. "I'll double my offer," she said desperately. "Not interested. Now get out of my office before I have you arrested for disturbing the peace." That night, Sarah returned to the holding pen to tell Ezekiel what had happened. She found him standing at the fence, his hands gripping the wooden slats so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. "I heard," he said quietly. "I won't give up," Sarah promised. "I'll find another way. I'll get more money or find someone who can pressure him or—" "No," Ezekiel interrupted. "You've done enough. More than enough. It's time for me to handle this myself." There was something in his voice that made Sarah step back. Her son's eyes held a coldness she had never seen before, a hardness that spoke of years of suffering and carefully controlled rage. "What are you planning?" she asked. "Justice," Ezekiel replied. "The kind that can't be bought or sold." What Sarah Freeman didn't know was that her son had already been in contact with the underground network for months before his capture. During his years as Henderson's agent, Ezekiel had built relationships with resistance leaders throughout Virginia and beyond. The network was more extensive and sophisticated than most people realized. It included not just runaway slaves and free blacks, but also sympathetic whites, Quakers, abolitionists, and others who opposed slavery on moral grounds. They operated safe houses, smuggling routes, and communication systems that rivaled anything used by legitimate businesses. At the center of the Virginia network was a man known only as the Conductor, a mysterious figure who coordinated resistance activities across multiple states. No one knew his real name or what he looked like, but his influence was felt everywhere the network operated. 3 days after Sarah's failed attempt to purchase Ezekiel's freedom, the Conductor sent a message to Blackwood's compound. It came in the form of a young black woman who claimed to be looking for work as a cook. When she was turned away, she left behind a small piece of paper hidden under a loose board near the kitchen door. Ezekiel found the message during his evening work detail. Written in a code he had learned years earlier, it contained just 4 words: "Ready when you are." That night, Ezekiel began putting his plan into motion. Using a network of signals and coded messages, He communicated with resistance members throughout Richmond. He shared the intelligence he had gathered about Blackwood's operation, guard schedules, security weaknesses, the location of important documents. Most importantly, he provided them with a list of targets for what would come next. The plan was audacious in its scope and precision. Rather than simply escaping from Blackwood's compound, Ezekiel intended to strike a blow that would shake the entire slavery system in Virginia. He would expose the network of cruelty and corruption that connected the worst plantation owners, and he would do it in a way that could not be ignored or covered up. But first he needed to escape. The breakout came on the night of October 10, 1847. It began with a carefully orchestrated distraction, a fire in one of the storage buildings that drew the guards away from the holding pens. While Blackwood's men fought the blaze, resistance members cut through the fence and led the imprisoned slaves to freedom. But Ezekiel didn't leave with the others. Instead, he made his way to Blackwood's office, where he knew the slave trader kept his most important records. For the next 2 hours, while chaos reigned outside, Ezekiel systematically photographed documents using a primitive camera provided by the network. Bills of sale, correspondence with plantation owners, records of illegal kidnappings, everything that would be needed to build a legal case against the entire operation. When he was finished, Ezekiel set fire to the office, ensuring that the original documents would be destroyed, but not before leaving behind a calling card, a piece of wood with a symbol burned into its surface, a cross surrounded by flames. By dawn, Cornelius Blackwood's slave trading empire was in ruins. The buildings had burned to the ground, the slaves had vanished, and the records that could have implicated dozens of plantation owners in illegal activities had been destroyed. But Blackwood himself had survived, and he was furious. "Find him," he told the sheriff when law enforcement arrived to investigate. "Find that scarred bastard and bring him back to me. I don't care what it costs." What Blackwood didn't realize was that Ezekiel Freeman was no longer just a runaway slave. He had become something far more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose and the resources of an entire resistance network at his disposal. The real war was just beginning. The fires began 3 nights after Ezekiel's escape from Blackwood's compound. They started small, a storage shed here, a tobacco barn there, but they followed a pattern that soon became impossible to ignore. Every target belonged to a plantation owner known for extreme cruelty. Every fire was set with professional precision, designed to destroy property without harming people. And at every site, investigators found the same calling card, a piece of wood bearing the symbol of a cross surrounded by flames. Sheriff William Crenshaw was the first to recognize that they were dealing with something unprecedented. A veteran lawman with 20 years of experience, Crenshaw had seen his share of slave rebellions and arson cases, but this was different. "It's not random," he told his deputy, Samuel Porter, as they stood in the smoldering ruins of the Henderson Plantations cotton gin. "Look at the precision, the timing, the target selection. This isn't the work of an angry mob or a desperate runaway. This is military-level planning." Porter, a young man fresh out of law school, was still struggling to understand the scope of what they were dealing with. But how could one man cover so much territory in such a short time? The fires were set almost simultaneously across a 50-mile radius. "Maybe it's not one man," Crenshaw replied. "Maybe it's an organization." What they didn't know was that it was both. Ezekiel Freeman was indeed working alone when it came to setting the fires, but he was supported by a network that provided intelligence, supplies, and safe houses. The resistance had been planning for something like this for years, waiting for the right person and the right moment to strike. Ezekiel's first target had been carefully chosen, the plantation where Marcus Henderson had conducted his medical experiments. The cotton gin and storage buildings burned to the ground, but the main house was left untouched. Hidden in the basement laboratory, investigators would later find evidence of Henderson's crimes, if they knew where to look. The second target was Riverside Plantation, where James Morrison ran his breeding program. Again, the agricultural buildings were destroyed while the residents remained intact. But Morrison's carefully maintained breeding records, stored in a fireproof safe in his office, mysteriously disappeared during the chaos. The third target was Oak Grove Plantation, where Robert Caldwell practiced collective punishment, The pattern repeated: property destroyed, people unharmed, evidence of crimes somehow preserved or exposed. By the end of the first week, 7 plantations had been hit. The economic damage was enormous, but the psychological impact was even greater. Plantation owners throughout Virginia began to realize that their wealth and power could not protect them from this mysterious avenger. But Ezekiel was just getting started. On October 20th, he struck at Magnolia Heights, Henry Patterson's plantation. This time, however, he did something different. Instead of simply burning the buildings and leaving, he took the time to liberate every slave on the property. The rescue operation was carried out with military precision. Working with a team of resistance members, Ezekiel evacuated over 200 enslaved people in a single night, moving them through a network of safe houses toward freedom in the north. But before leaving, he made sure that Patterson would understand exactly why his plantation had been targeted. In the main house, he left behind copies of documents detailing Patterson's psychological torture methods, along with testimonies from former slaves describing their experiences. The message was clear. This wasn't just about property destruction, it was about justice. As news of the attacks spread throughout Virginia and beyond, Ezekiel Freeman began to take on mythical proportions. Enslaved people whispered his name in the quarters, calling him the Ghost or the Firebringer. Free blacks and abolitionists hailed him as a hero, a man who had finally stood up to the system that had oppressed his people for generations. But it was among the plantation owners that his legend grew most powerfully, as a figure of terror and retribution. "He's not human," Thomas Whitmore told a gathering of plantation owners in Richmond. "No man could move that fast, strike that precisely, disappear so completely. He's like smoke, was there one moment, gone the next." The fear was palpable in their voices as they shared stories and rumors. Some claimed that Ezekiel could walk through walls. Others said he could become invisible at will. A few insisted that he was already dead, that he was the ghost of some long-murdered slave returned to seek vengeance. The truth was both simpler and more complex than any of their theories. Ezekiel Freeman was very much alive and very much human, but he had spent 25 years learning to be invisible in a system that treated him as less than human. He knew how to move through the countryside without being seen, how to blend into crowds of slaves, how to disappear into the network of resistance that existed parallel to white society. More importantly, he understood his enemies better than they understood themselves. He knew their schedules, their habits, their weaknesses. He had spent years listening to their conversations, observing their behavior, learning their secrets, and he used that knowledge like a weapon. When Robert Caldwell hired extra guards to protect his plantation, Ezekiel struck at his warehouse in town instead. When Henry Patterson moved his family to Richmond for safety, Ezekiel burned his cotton processing facility. When James Morrison tried to hide his breeding records in a bank vault, Ezekiel somehow obtained copies and distributed them to every newspaper in Virginia. Each attack was perfectly timed, precisely executed, and impossible to prevent. The plantation owners began to feel like they were fighting a ghost, an enemy who could strike anywhere, any time, without warning. But Ezekiel's greatest weapon wasn't his ability to set fires or evade capture. It was his ability to expose the truth about slavery in a way that could not be ignored or dismissed. The documents he had collected during his years as Henderson's agent, combined with the evidence he gathered from each plantation he attacked, painted a picture of systematic brutality that shocked even slavery's defenders. Medical experiments, breeding programs, torture techniques, illegal kidnappings, the full scope of the system's horrors was being revealed to the world. Northern newspapers picked up the story, publishing detailed accounts of Ezekiel's attacks, along with the evidence he had uncovered. Abolitionist speakers used his story to illustrate the moral bankruptcy of slavery. Even some Southern moderates began to question whether the system had gone too far. But Ezekiel wasn't finished. The attacks in October were just the beginning of a campaign that would ultimately reshape the debate over slavery in America. As November approached, he began planning something that would make everything that had come before seem like a mere prelude. The real reckoning was still to come. By November 1st, the situation in Virginia had reached a crisis point. 37 plantations had been attacked, causing millions of dollars in damage, and liberating over 800 enslaved people. The state government, under pressure from plantation owners and business interests, declared martial law in affected counties and authorized the use of military force to capture Ezekiel Freeman. General Robert Harrison, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, was placed in command of the operation. Harrison brought with him 200 federal troops, along with professional slave catchers, tracking dogs, and the latest in surveillance technology. "This man has made a mockery of law and order in Virginia," Harrison declared at a press conference in Richmond. "He has destroyed property, incited rebellion, and threatened the very foundation of our society. We will find him, and we will bring him to justice." But Harrison quickly discovered that hunting Ezekiel Freeman was unlike any military operation he had ever conducted. The first problem was intelligence. Despite offering substantial rewards for information leading to Ezekiel's capture, the military found that the local population was either unable or unwilling to provide useful intelligence. Enslaved people claimed to know nothing, free blacks insisted they had never heard of him, and even many whites seemed reluctant to cooperate fully with the investigation. The second problem was terrain. Virginia's landscape of forests, swamps, and mountains provided countless hiding places for someone who knew how to use them. Ezekiel had spent years traveling through this territory as Henderson's agent, and he knew every back road, every hidden trail, every safe house in the resistance network. The third problem was that Ezekiel refused to behave like a typical fugitive. Instead of hiding and trying to escape to the north, he continued his campaign of attacks. But now his targets were even more carefully chosen, and his methods had evolved to counter the military's tactics. On November 5th, he struck at Blackwater Plantation, while General Harrison's troops were searching for him 50 miles away. The attack followed his usual pattern: agricultural buildings destroyed, main house untouched, enslaved people liberated, but this time he left behind something new. Nailed to the plantation's front gate was a letter addressed to General Harrison. "General, you hunt a ghost with the tools of war, but ghosts cannot be captured by soldiers. I am not your enemy unless you make me so. My quarrel is not with the United States, but with those who have perverted its ideals of freedom and justice. End this manhunt, and I will end my campaign. Continue it, and I will show you that there are worse things than burning barns. E.F." Harrison was furious, but he was also beginning to understand that he was dealing with an opponent unlike any he had faced before. This wasn't a simple criminal or even a typical rebel leader. Ezekiel Freeman was conducting what amounted to a guerrilla war, using tactics that the military was ill-equipped to counter. As the manhunt intensified, the true scope of the resistance network supporting Ezekiel began to emerge. Federal investigators, working with local law enforcement, uncovered a sophisticated organization that stretched across multiple states and included members from all levels of society. The network operated through a system of cells, each knowing only enough about the overall organization to perform their specific functions. Safe houses provided shelter and supplies. Couriers carried messages and intelligence. Sympathizers in positions of authority provided warnings about law enforcement activities. At the center of it all was Sarah Freeman, Ezekiel's mother. From her modest boarding house in Richmond, Sarah coordinated much of the network's activities in Virginia. She used her position as a respected member of the free black community to gather intelligence, recruit new members, and provide support for escaped slaves. When federal agents finally identified her role in the organization, they moved quickly to arrest her. But Sarah Freeman was not an easy target. "You want to arrest me for what?" she asked when Agent Thomas Crawford arrived at her boarding house with a warrant. "Conspiracy to incite rebellion, harboring fugitive slaves, and providing material support to a known criminal," Crawford replied. Sarah laughed, a sound that held no humor. "And what evidence do you have of these crimes?" Crawford had to admit that the evidence was largely circumstantial. The network had been careful to avoid leaving paper trails or other physical evidence. Most of their communication was conducted through coded messages and face-to-face meetings that left no records. "We know you're his mother," Crawford said. "We know you've been in contact with him." "Being someone's mother isn't a crime," Sarah replied. And I haven't seen my son since he was 7 years old when he was kidnapped and sold into slavery. If you want to arrest someone for that crime, I suggest you start with Cornelius Blackwood. The legal case against Sarah Freeman quickly fell apart. Without solid evidence, prosecutors were reluctant to bring charges against a woman who had become something of a folk hero in the black community. Her arrest would only generate more sympathy for Ezekiel's cause and potentially spark the kind of widespread uprising that authorities were desperately trying to avoid. But the investigation did reveal the extent to which the resistance network had penetrated Virginia society. Members included not just enslaved and free blacks, but also white abolitionists, Quaker families, and even some plantation owners who had grown disgusted with the system's excesses. One of the most surprising discoveries was that Dr. William Thornton, a respected physician who had treated many plantation families, had been providing medical supplies and intelligence to the network for years. "I took an oath to do no harm," Thornton told investigators when his involvement was discovered. "I cannot stand by and watch human beings tortured and murdered in the name of profit." The revelation that the resistance network included prominent white citizens sent shockwaves through Virginia's elite. If they couldn't trust their own doctors, lawyers, and business associates, how could they hope to maintain control over the enslaved population? As the manhunt continued without success, Ezekiel began employing psychological warfare tactics that proved even more effective than his physical attacks. Instead of simply burning buildings, he began leaving behind evidence of the crimes he had witnessed during his years in slavery. At each plantation he attacked, investigators would find carefully documented accounts of abuse, torture, and murder, evidence that had been hidden for years but was now exposed to public scrutiny. The psychological impact on plantation owners was devastating. Men who had thought their secrets were safe suddenly found their darkest crimes exposed to the world. Some fled Virginia entirely, abandoning their plantations rather than face the shame and legal consequences of exposure. Others tried to fight back, but found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. Robert Caldwell hired a team of private investigators to track down Ezekiel, but the investigators were themselves infiltrated by network members who fed them false information. James Morrison attempted to bribe local officials to suppress evidence of his breeding program, but copies of the documents had already been distributed to newspapers throughout the North. Henry Patterson tried a different approach, publicly confessing to his crimes and begging for forgiveness. But his confession only served to validate the evidence that Ezekiel had been presenting, lending credibility to accusations against other plantation owners. The most dramatic psychological victory came when Ezekiel targeted Cornelius Blackwood himself. On November 20th, Blackwood woke to find his entire slave trading operation in flames, not just the buildings, but his house, his records, everything. But this time Ezekiel had left behind something more than just his usual calling card. Nailed to what remained of Blackwood's front door was a detailed account of the slave traders' crimes, including the kidnapping of the Freeman family 18 years earlier. The document included dates, locations, and the names of other families that Blackwood had destroyed through his illegal activities. But the most chilling part was the personal message at the end. "Cornelius Blackwood, you destroyed my family when I was 7 years old. You stole my freedom, my childhood, my innocence. You thought you had broken me, but you only made me stronger. Now I am a man, and I have come to collect the debt you owe. This is not revenge, this is justice, and justice delayed is not justice denied." Ezekiel Freeman. Blackwood barely escaped the fire with his life, but his empire was completely destroyed. More importantly, the evidence that Ezekiel had left behind led to criminal charges against the slave trader for kidnapping, fraud, and murder. For the first time in his career, Cornelius Blackwood found himself on the wrong side of the law. As November drew to a close, it became clear that the manhunt was not only failing, but was actually strengthening Ezekiel's position. Every military operation that came up empty-handed made him seem more ghost-like and invincible. Every plantation that was attacked, despite heavy security, made the authorities look incompetent. More importantly, the constant media attention was spreading Ezekiel's story throughout the country. Northern newspapers portrayed him as a heroic freedom fighter, while even some southern publications began to question whether the plantation owners he was targeting deserved sympathy. The turning point came on November 28th, when Ezekiel did something that no one expected. Instead of attacking another plantation, he appeared in broad daylight in the center of Richmond, walking calmly down Main Street, as if he were any other free black man going about his business. Dozens of people saw him, including several federal agents who were part of the manhunt. But by the time they organized a response, he had vanished again, leaving behind only a letter posted on the door of the state capitol building. The letter was addressed to the people of Virginia. Citizens, for 2 months I have waged war against those who profit from human misery. I have burned their barns and exposed their crimes, but I have harmed no person and destroyed no homes. I am not your enemy, unless you choose to make me so. I was born free in this state, but I was kidnapped and enslaved when I was 7 years old. For 18 years, I suffered under a system that treats human beings as property. I have seen horrors that would shock your conscience if you knew of them. I do not seek to destroy Virginia or overthrow its government. I seek only justice for crimes that have been hidden too long in darkness. Give me that justice and I will lay down my arms. Deny it to me, and I will continue my campaign until every plantation that profits from torture and murder lies in ashes. The choice is yours. Ezekiel Freeman. The letter was reprinted in newspapers throughout the country, sparking a national debate about slavery, justice, and the limits of resistance to oppression. For the first time, many Americans were forced to confront the reality of what slavery actually meant, not the romanticized version portrayed in popular culture, but the brutal system of exploitation and abuse that Ezekiel had documented in such devastating detail. Public opinion began to shift, particularly in the North. Abolitionist groups organized rallies in support of Ezekiel Freeman. Prominent politicians began calling for investigations into the crimes he had exposed. Even some Southern moderates started to question whether the plantation system had become too extreme to defend. But the plantation owners and their political allies were not ready to surrender. If they couldn't capture Ezekiel Freeman through military force, they would try a different approach. They would attempt to destroy him through betrayal. The plan to capture Ezekiel Freeman through betrayal was conceived by a consortium of Virginia's most powerful plantation owners working in coordination with federal authorities. They understood that conventional military tactics had failed because Ezekiel had the support of an extensive network of sympathizers. The only way to reach him was to turn that network against itself. The key to their strategy was Marcus Whitfield, a free black man who had been secretly working as an informant for the authorities while maintaining his position within the resistance network. Whitfield was a skilled actor who had convinced network leaders that he was a committed abolitionist, when in reality he was being paid substantial sums to provide intelligence about their operations. Whitfield's mission was to arrange a meeting with Ezekiel Freeman under the pretense of planning a major operation to liberate enslaved people from multiple plantations simultaneously. The meeting would take place at an isolated location where federal troops could surround and capture their target. But Whitfield had underestimated both Ezekiel's intelligence and the loyalty of the network members who had come to see him as more than just a leader. They saw him as a symbol of hope and resistance that transcended any individual person. The first sign that something was wrong came when Sarah Freeman received a coded message from one of her contacts in the federal investigation. The message was brief but alarming. "The wolf wears sheep's clothing. Trust no one you haven't known for years." Sarah immediately understood that there was a traitor within the network, but she didn't know who it was or how deeply they had penetrated the organization. She sent out warnings to all network cells, but she couldn't be sure the warnings themselves weren't being intercepted. Meanwhile, Ezekiel was dealing with his own suspicions. During his years as Henderson's agent, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to read people's motivations and detect deception. When Whitfield approached him with the proposal for a joint operation, something felt wrong. The plan was too elaborate, too risky, and too convenient. It required Ezekiel to expose himself in ways that went against every principle of operational security he had learned. Most importantly, it came at a time when the authorities were under enormous pressure to produce results in their manhunt. But Ezekiel also saw an opportunity. If the authorities were indeed planning to use this meeting as a trap, he could turn their own strategy against them. Instead of avoiding the meeting, he would attend it, but not in the way they expected. The meeting was scheduled to take place at an abandoned mill on the outskirts of Millfield County, a location that Whitfield claimed would provide security and privacy for planning their operation. Federal troops under the command of General Harrison positioned themselves in the surrounding woods, ready to close the trap when Ezekiel arrived. But when the appointed time came, the man who walked into the mill was not Ezekiel Freeman. It was Cornelius Blackwood. The slave trader whose empire Ezekiel had destroyed weeks earlier stumbled into the mill with his hands bound behind his back and a gag in his mouth. Pinned to his shirt was a note written in Ezekiel's distinctive handwriting. "General Harrison, you want to capture a criminal? Here is one whose crimes are documented and proven. Cornelius Blackwood has kidnapped free blacks, murdered enslaved people, and destroyed families for profit. He is guilty of crimes that would shock your conscience if you had one. I deliver him to you as a gesture of good faith. Now deliver justice, or admit that your law is nothing but a tool of oppression. E.F." The federal troops found themselves in an impossible situation. They had come to capture Ezekiel Freeman, but instead they had been handed a man whose crimes were indeed well documented and legally prosecutable. Blackwood's own records, which Ezekiel had preserved and distributed, provided overwhelming evidence of illegal activities that even slavery's defenders could not justify. But the real shock came when General Harrison realized that Ezekiel Freeman was actually present at the meeting. He had been watching from the woods as the trap was sprung. "General Harrison," a voice called from the tree line, "I believe we need to talk." Ezekiel stepped into the clearing, his hands raised to show that he was unarmed. He was exactly as the descriptions had portrayed him, tall, lean, with the distinctive scar across his left cheek, and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of generations. But what struck Harrison most was his calm dignity. This was not a desperate fugitive or a crazed rebel. This was a man who carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew he was fighting for a just cause. "You're under arrest," Harrison said, though his voice lacked conviction. "For what crimes?" Ezekiel asked. "Destroying property. I have done that and I do not deny it. But I have harmed no person, threatened no family, stolen nothing that was not already stolen from me. Can Cornelius Blackwood say the same? Can any of the plantation owners I have targeted say the same?" Harrison found himself in an unprecedented situation. Military protocol demanded that he arrest Ezekiel Freeman immediately, but the man's calm demeanor and reasonable words made such action seem somehow inappropriate. "You have incited rebellion," Harrison said. "You have destroyed millions of dollars worth of property. You have undermined law and order throughout Virginia." "I have exposed crimes that your law refused to acknowledge," Ezekiel replied. "I have brought justice to places where justice had never existed. I have given hope to people who had no reason to hope. If that is rebellion, then I am proud to be a rebel." The conversation that followed lasted for over an hour, with federal troops maintaining a respectful distance, while their commander engaged in what amounted to a philosophical debate with the man they had been sent to capture. Ezekiel spoke of his childhood as a free boy, his kidnapping and enslavement, his years of witnessing horrors that the law not only permitted, but protected. He described the medical experiments, the breeding programs, the systematic torture that he had documented in such devastating detail. Harrison, despite his military training and political loyalties, found himself moved by Ezekiel's story. Here was a man who had suffered injustices that would have broken most people, but who had channeled his pain into a campaign for justice rather than simple revenge. "What do you want?" Harrison finally asked. "I want the crimes I have exposed to be prosecuted," Ezekiel said. "I want the system that permits such crimes to be reformed. I want my people to be treated as human beings rather than property. I want justice. And if you don't get it," Ezekiel's expression hardened, "then I will continue my campaign until I do. I have nothing left to lose, General. They have already taken everything from me except my life, and that life has meaning only if I use it to fight for justice." The capture of Ezekiel Freeman should have been the end of the story, but instead it became the beginning of something much larger. The trial that followed became a national sensation, drawing attention from around the world and forcing America to confront the reality of its slavery system in ways it had never done before. Ezekiel's defense team was led by Thaddeus Stevens, a prominent abolitionist lawyer who saw the case as an opportunity to put slavery itself on trial. Stevens argued that Ezekiel's actions were justified as a response to crimes that the legal system had refused to address. The prosecution, led by Virginia Attorney General William Preston, faced an almost impossible task. They had to convince a jury that Ezekiel Freeman was a dangerous criminal, while simultaneously defending a system that had permitted the horrors he had exposed. The trial lasted 3 months and featured testimony from hundreds of witnesses. Former slaves described the conditions they had endured on the plantations Ezekiel had attacked. Medical experts testified about the experiments that Marcus Henderson had conducted. Legal scholars debated the limits of resistance to unjust laws, but the most powerful testimony came from Ezekiel himself. For 5 days, he took the witness stand and told his story in his own words. He spoke without notes, his voice calm and measured, describing 25 years of slavery with a precision and dignity that left the courtroom in stunned silence. He described watching his mother beaten for trying to protect him. He told of seeing his father murdered for the crime of loving his family. He recounted the medical experiments he had been forced to assist with, the breeding programs he had witnessed, the countless acts of cruelty he had observed during his years as Henderson's agent. "I did not choose to become a symbol of resistance," he said during his final day of testimony. "I chose only to seek justice for crimes that had been hidden in darkness for too long. If that makes me a criminal in your eyes, then I accept that judgment. But history will judge us all, and I am confident that history will vindicate my actions." The jury deliberated for 6 days before reaching their verdict. Guilty of arson and destruction of property, but with a recommendation for mercy based on the extraordinary circumstances of the case. Ezekiel Freeman was sentenced to death, but the sentence sparked protests throughout the North and even in parts of the South. Petitions for clemency poured in from around the world. Prominent politicians, religious leaders, and intellectuals called for his sentence to be commuted. But before any decision could be made about clemency, Ezekiel Freeman disappeared. On the night before his scheduled execution, guards at the Richmond City Jail discovered that Ezekiel Freeman's cell was empty. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of outside assistance, no indication of how he had escaped. The cell door was still locked from the outside. The window was too small for a man of Ezekiel's size to fit through. The walls showed no signs of tunneling or other attempts at escape. He had simply vanished. The disappearance sparked the largest manhunt in Virginia history, involving federal troops, state militia, and professional bounty hunters. Rewards totaling over $50,000 were offered for information leading to his capture. Every road, every river, every hiding place in the state was searched, but Ezekiel Freeman was never found. Some claimed that he had been helped by the resistance network, spirited away through the Underground Railroad to freedom in Canada. Others insisted that sympathizers within the jail had arranged his escape and helped him flee the country. A few whispered that he had transcended human limitations entirely, becoming something more than mortal, a spirit of justice that could not be contained by walls or chains. But the truth was both simpler and more complex than any of these theories. Ezekiel Freeman had indeed escaped, but not through any supernatural means. The resistance network had spent months planning his rescue, infiltrating the jail staff, mapping the building's layout, and preparing multiple escape routes. On the night of his disappearance, network members had used a combination of bribery, distraction, and carefully timed diversions to create a window of opportunity. Ezekiel had been spirited out of the jail through a tunnel that connected to the city's sewer system, then moved through a series of safe houses to a ship waiting in the James River. By dawn, he was aboard a vessel bound for Nova Scotia, where he would spend the next several years recovering from his ordeal and planning his next move. But his physical escape was only part of the story. The real victory was what he had accomplished through his trial and the publicity surrounding his case. The trial of Ezekiel Freeman marked a turning point in the national debate over slavery. For the first time, Americans had been forced to confront detailed, documented evidence of the system's worst excesses. The testimony presented during the trial was reprinted in newspapers throughout the country, sparking conversations that had been avoided for decades. In the North, Ezekiel became a folk hero, whose story inspired a new generation of abolitionists. His calm dignity during the trial, his articulate defense of his actions, and his mysterious disappearance all contributed to a legend that grew more powerful with each retelling. In the South, the reaction was more complex. While many plantation owners and their supporters denounced Ezekiel as a dangerous criminal, others began to question whether the system had indeed gone too far. Some of the plantation owners he had targeted were prosecuted for their crimes, leading to reforms in how enslaved people were treated. More importantly, Ezekiel's campaign had demonstrated that the system was vulnerable. If one man with limited resources could cause such widespread disruption, what might happen if the resistance became more organized and widespread? The fear of another Ezekiel Freeman led to increased security measures on plantations throughout the South, but it also led to a gradual recognition that the system was unsustainable in its current form. The economic costs of maintaining such security, combined with the constant threat of resistance, began to erode the profitability that had made slavery attractive to many plantation owners. But Ezekiel's most lasting impact was on the enslaved population itself. Word of his campaign spread through the slave quarters like wildfire, carried by the same underground networks that had supported his operations. For the first time in generations, enslaved people had seen one of their own successfully challenge the system and live to tell about it. The psychological impact was profound. Ezekiel Freeman had proven that resistance was possible, that the masters were not invincible, that justice could be achieved even in the face of overwhelming odds. His story became part of the oral tradition that sustained hope in the darkest places of American slavery. Songs were composed about the ghost who walked in fire. Stories were told of his supernatural abilities and his promise to return when his people needed him most. Children born in slavery learned his name before they learned to read, carrying his legend forward into a new generation. For 11 years after his disappearance, there were occasional sightings of Ezekiel Freeman throughout the South. A tall man with a scarred face helping slaves escape in Georgia. A mysterious figure setting fires at particularly brutal plantations in Alabama. A ghost-like presence that appeared wherever justice was needed most. But it wasn't until 1859 that Ezekiel himself confirmed that he was still alive and still fighting. The confirmation came in the form of a letter published simultaneously in newspapers throughout the North and South. The letter was addressed to John Brown, the abolitionist, who had recently been captured after his failed raid on Harper's Ferry. Brother Brown, I have read of your capture and your noble attempt to strike a blow for freedom. Though your methods differed from mine, your heart beats with the same passion for justice that has driven my own actions. You will face death with courage, as I was prepared to do 11 years ago. But know that your sacrifice will not be in vain. The fire you have lit will spread, and the cause for which you die will ultimately triumph. I write this letter not to save you, for I know you would not wish to be saved at the cost of abandoning your principles, but to let the world know that the spirit of resistance lives on. The ghost still walks, and he will continue to walk until every chain is broken and every slave is free. Your brother in the struggle for justice, Ezekiel Freeman. The letter caused a sensation, confirming that the legendary figure was indeed still alive and still committed to his cause. But more importantly, it demonstrated that Ezekiel had evolved from a lone avenger into something larger, a symbol of resistance that transcended any individual person. When the Civil War began in 1861, Ezekiel Freeman emerged from the shadows to play a crucial role in the Union's eventual victory. Working with the Underground Railroad and Union intelligence services, he helped coordinate the escape of thousands of enslaved people from Confederate territory. His network, which had been built during his years as a fugitive, proved invaluable for gathering intelligence about Confederate troop movements and supply lines. Former slaves who had been inspired by his story provided information that helped Union forces plan their campaigns. But Ezekiel's most important contribution was symbolic. His presence in Union camps, his speeches to newly freed slaves, and his continued commitment to the cause of justice provided a powerful example of what freedom could mean for African Americans. General Ulysses S. Grant, who met Ezekiel during the siege of Richmond, later wrote, I have known many brave men in my time, but none who carried themselves with the quiet dignity and unshakable determination of Ezekiel Freeman. He was living proof that the human spirit cannot be broken, no matter how great the oppression. When Richmond finally fell in April 1865, Ezekiel Freeman was among the first to enter the city. He walked the streets where he had once been held in chains, visiting the sites of his childhood and the places where his campaign had begun. At the ruins of Cornelius Blackwood's slave trading compound, he placed a simple wooden marker bearing the names of all the families that had been destroyed by the slave trade. The marker bore his familiar symbol, a cross surrounded by flames, but with a new addition, the word justice carved beneath it. With the end of slavery, Ezekiel Freeman faced a choice that many freedom fighters must eventually confront. What to do when the war is won? For some, the answer would have been simple: retire to a quiet life, enjoy the freedom that had been so hard won, let others handle the work of building a new society. But Ezekiel understood that the end of slavery was only the beginning of the struggle for true equality. During Reconstruction, he worked tirelessly to help former slaves transition to freedom. He established schools, organized voter registration drives, and fought against the black codes and other laws designed to maintain white supremacy under a different name. His mother, Sarah Freeman, had survived the war years and was reunited with her son in Richmond. Together, they opened a school for former slaves, teaching not just reading and writing, but also the skills needed to navigate freedom in a hostile world. Freedom is not something that is given, Ezekiel would tell his students. It is something that must be claimed, defended, and constantly renewed. The chains may be broken, but the struggle for justice never ends. But even as he worked to build a better future, Ezekiel knew that his time was limited. The years of struggle had taken their toll on his body, and he was beginning to feel the effects of a lifetime of hardship and stress. In 1870, at the age of 48, Ezekiel Freeman died peacefully in his sleep at the school he had founded. His last words, according to his mother, were, "The fire still burns. It will always burn." The death of Ezekiel Freeman marked the end of a life, but not the end of a legend. In the years that followed, his story continued to inspire new generations of freedom fighters and civil rights activists. During the Jim Crow era, when the gains of Reconstruction were being systematically rolled back, activists invoked Ezekiel's memory as a reminder that resistance was both possible and necessary. The symbol of the cross surrounded by flames appeared on banners and posters throughout the South, a sign that the spirit of justice could not be extinguished. During the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X drew inspiration from Ezekiel's example. King spoke of him as a man who had turned the fire of oppression into the light of justice, while Malcolm X praised his willingness to use any means necessary to achieve freedom. The school that Ezekiel and his mother had founded continued to operate well into the 20th century, producing generations of teachers, lawyers, doctors, and activists who carried forward his commitment to education and justice. But perhaps the most powerful testament to Ezekiel's legacy was the way his story continued to evolve and inspire new interpretations. Each generation found in his example something relevant to their own struggles, whether against slavery, segregation, poverty, or other forms of oppression. Today, more than 150 years after Ezekiel Freeman's death, his story continues to resonate with people around the world. Historians have documented his life and campaigns in exhaustive detail, but the man himself remains somewhat mysterious, a figure who seems to exist at the intersection of history and legend. In Virginia, historical markers now stand at many of the sites where Ezekiel conducted his campaign. The plantation where he was born into slavery has been converted into a museum dedicated to telling the story of resistance to oppression. The jail from which he escaped has been preserved as a monument to the power of hope over despair. But the most fitting memorial to Ezekiel Freeman may be the countless acts of courage and resistance that his story continues to inspire. Every time someone stands up to injustice, every time someone refuses to accept oppression as inevitable, every time someone chooses hope over despair, The spirit of Ezekiel Freeman lives on. The fire he lit in 1847 still burns today, carried forward by all those who believe that justice is not just a dream, but a goal worth fighting for, no matter the cost. And sometimes, on quiet nights in Virginia, when the wind carries the scent of smoke, and the moon casts long shadows through the trees, people still report seeing a tall figure walking the old plantation roads. A man with a scarred face and eyes that hold the weight of generations, carrying himself with the quiet dignity of someone who knows that the struggle for justice never truly ends. They say he nods once as if acknowledging their presence, and then melts back into the darkness. Because some promises transcend death, some spirits refuse to be forgotten, and some fires burn eternal, the ghost still walks, and he will continue to walk until every chain is broken and every soul is free. The story of Ezekiel Freeman reminds us that history is written not just by the powerful, but by those who refuse to be silenced. His legacy lives on in every act of courage, every stand for justice, every voice that speaks truth to power. From a kidnapped child to a legendary freedom fighter, from a man seeking personal justice to a symbol of universal resistance, Ezekiel Freeman's journey shows us that one person's commitment to justice can indeed change the world. His fires may have burned out long ago, but the light they cast still illuminates the path toward a more just and equitable society. In every civil rights march, every protest against oppression, every act of solidarity with the oppressed, the spirit of the forgotten ghost lives on. What did you think of this incredible epic? Did Ezekiel Freeman's story move you as much as it moved us? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and let us know what lessons from his life resonate most with you today. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more untold stories from history that will leave you speechless. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this powerful message of hope and resistance, because the most powerful stories are often the ones that have been forgotten, until brave souls like you help bring them back to light.